You're listening to Trek FM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Hello and welcome to TFM's local books and comics show here for Star Trek. And I am just one of your hosts, Matthew Rushing, and with me, as he is always these days, the illustrious Captain Christopher Jones.
Illustrious, huh? I thought you were going to say luminous or illuminated or whatever's going on here in my little studio space with the lighting as we get ready to talk about some comics today.
And a great studio lighting you have. In fact, I love the wonderful picture of Deep Space Nine. It's as if you're floating out there in space with our beloved space station. So, yeah, it's bringing warm feelings to my heart, Chris.
Yeah, this is the closest that we're going to get for a while to any more HD high-definition Deep Space Nine, I think.
Seriously. Oh, man. Well, we'll go down that road another day, but we're really excited because this episode we got a great interview with James Swallow talking about his brand new book, The Dark Veil, all about the Titan in the Picard universe. So we're so excited to have him back. And before we get there, of course, we've got a couple of comics that we're going to talk about, but we do just want to remind everybody that, you can find us wherever you get your podcast here with Literary Treks. Chris and I were actually even talking about before the show about how we've got some things in the works to be able to bring you a couple more episodes throughout the year as well. So stay tuned for those. We're definitely committed to making sure that you get your Literary Treks podcast. But you can find us on Twitter at TrekFM. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. Of course, you can find us in the Babel Conference, where you can discuss all of the things going on here on the network with fans from around the world. If you happen to be on Apple Podcasts or any of the Apple products, please give us a star rating review, help people find the show. All of those places, we want to make sure, of course, you're subscribed so you get the show as soon as it drops. But Chris, in our news section, we've got a couple more comic reviews. They're very steady these days with comics. So we're in the next issue, which is the third issue of Seven's Reckoning. And this is definitely an interesting issue because I would say that really it feels mostly like the setup for the end. So there are a couple of, things that we get revealed here, but on a whole, the issue itself, I would say it's going to be incumbent on the end to really know whether or not how all this plays out. And I'll be honest, is that the first couple issues I thought were really interesting, and this one has left me a little less enthused for the comic than I was with those first two issues.
Yeah, I can see that because I kind of have the same feeling going through. But I was thinking that last time, I remember I asked you why you thought Seven might pick a side in this, and how it might play into the idea of Seven's Reckoning. And there's one point in this issue where they talk about how the story can be changed. So again, as we talked about last time, it's kind of like Battlestar Galactica. The story is cyclical, right? That's what these people believe. But they have a feeling here, this character, I think it's Grebe, right? The guy who thinks that he's going to be the bearer who can change the story. And he thinks that the story can be changed. And then there is another point where they're told that if they surrender, then this segment will not remain part of their narrative.
Right.
So it's like a part of their life that can be removed. And in that sense, the story can be changed a bit. And so that started making me think about Seven and how she was rescued from the Borg Collective by Voyager. So as a child, she had one life, and then she became a Borg drone. And that could have been the end of her story, but she was pulled away by Janeway and the Voyager crew, and now she has a different life. And in a sense, that segment can be removed from her narrative. Not really, because it's always a part of who she is, but she's no longer stuck there. That's not the path that she's on for the outcome of her story. And so that just struck me as maybe the most interesting part of this. Of course, you know, there's the twist about the fact that the people who are being held down here are the past leader was one of them, not the other race. So, you know, there's that twist there. But this thing about Seven is what stood out to me as maybe being the hook in this episode, or this part of the 4-part comic.
Yeah, I thought, you know, as you were mentioning that whole idea with, you know, the Vesh finding out that it was actually them who was the Dawn Bringer. I mean, the statue in this room that they're not even allowed to go into, that, you know, him and Seven find their way into, allows them to see that, you know, it was them that was the Dawn Bringer originally. But
it's even more insidious than that, because once they get in the room, they find a false statue that's there to support the story, and then Seven has to dig more to find the truth. So, you know, that was an interesting layer of how they're keeping the Vesh down.
Yeah, and I thought that that was one part of the comic that I didn't really like, because I didn't feel like they were doing a good enough job of explaining what Seven was doing. They just kind of like...
true.
It just kind of came out. It was almost like, you know, it's a comic, so show, don't tell. And they just kind of tell us that, oh, she's found out this information. And like, okay. But I was thinking about what you were talking about with how, you know, this change of story. And I think in some ways, maybe what they're trying to say with this comic is that also Seven... the Borg lied to her. Like, you know, the Borg lied.
Right.
And that lie controlled her life. And so once she was pulled from the lie, now she has a whole new perspective on life. You know, she's living life again in a way that she would have never thought possible under, you know, Borg doctrine. And I think that's interesting, but I also don't feel like this comic has really, so far, done a fantastic job of really making those connections. Like, I feel like I'm having to really pull out those connections myself, but not in a good way, because they're, like, really well portrayed. I just feel like it wasn't till you said that something clicked in my brain. Oh, okay, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I think maybe we could use a few flashbacks, maybe a few of her memories of being in the collective and feeling like she was being lied to or oppressed, or she couldn't chart her own path. As a Borg drone, she's not going to have that desire anyway. You know, that's sort of us looking back at it now after she's been severed from the collective. Then maybe she could look back and see that. So it might be a little bit difficult to portray, but I do think that some of those flashbacks anyway might help build the connection that I think is what they're going for in this story. When we get to the end of the story, and it will be revealed, I suspect, in the 4th part, then we can look back at the entire 4 parts together, and it probably will be a little bit clearer along the way, just because we know what's going to happen. But yeah, as we go, I've been having a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So then the next comic we've got is Star Trek Year 5, number 18, and you know, the Enterprise is still on its way home, and they are passing a planet, and it's Proxima Centauri. And it turns out that there is a virus, a pandemic happening on this planet that is killing people quite quickly, and it seems to be going through the air. I was like, I get where this comic is coming from, but I'm not quite sure that I need more pandemic in my life. I think a year of it in the real world was enough. So I just say right up front, I don't love that we're doing this in this comic because I'm so tired of hearing about it. I want my entertainment to have something else that I can focus on. Star Trek can do other things right now than give me this.
Yeah, I had the same feeling initially. And at the start, it definitely feels like an on-the-nose thing of there's a pandemic. You even see people with scarves pulled up over their noses, and then the leader has like the clear mask, which I don't know if you guys have those in the US, but I've seen people wearing them here in Japan sometimes that are like a very clear, not like the face shield type thing, but just like small that fits over your nose and your mouth down to your chin. But anyway, but there is another angle to this, which is that it is a virus that's airborne, but it doesn't really seem to, within the story, be a pandemic. It's more like a biological terrorist attack.
Yeah.
Carried out by Gary Seven's cat Isis, which is, an unfortunate connection name-wise these days, but that's the character's name. And that's sort of what was interesting to me about the story is why would she be attacking the capital city of Proxima Centauri? We know from the previous issue that she and Gary Seven are somehow involved in this plot related to the presidency of the Federation. Yes. So essentially we've got a terrorist attack against the capital city of a Federation planet by someone who's involved with a plot against the presidency of the Federation, but we don't know right now why or what's going on.
Yeah, and my guess is that they're doing this as a way to basically wag the dog to get what they want, which is a more isolationist, populist Federation. So that's my guess. But that is where. And I'm glad that you brought us to that point because that is the point where this became interesting, and then not only that, but there's an interesting tidbit we hear, and then there was a discussion between Bones and Kirk about Spock and how Spock has been unusually animated recently, and Bones is worried about him. And I think what we're going to get here, too, is planting the seeds for why Spock would leave the Enterprise and go to Vulcan to try and purge all emotion, finally, in the motion picture. So that I'm really interested to see. And then, of course, fascinatingly enough, and not shocking enough, because it's not shocking at all, but Bones is the one who is exposed to this virus and therefore doesn't look like he's going to be able to help too much with trying to figure out what this virus is. And that's kind of where we leave everything. The Enterprise has got a sick bay operation in their hangar deck as a quarantine area. And so those setups, with what's going on with Bones, what's going on with Spock, and then the idea of what the heck is going on with Isis and why is she doing all this, that is fascinating. And so I'm glad that this comic did not just go for the complete obvious, and it took that and it's now running with it in a way it's telling a Star Trek story, so far I have to say, coming back to the comics. Here with the year 5, I'm enjoying this. I think it's really interesting idea, this whole thought process of them coming back home and their journey back home and the reflections they're having, but also just kind of the way that they're setting up what, where these characters are going to go to before we see them again in the motion picture. So I like it. I'm really interested now to see where this is going to go.
Yeah, I'm curious to find out what Gary Seven's role is in all this. I had assumed that Isis is just doing this because Gary Seven has told her to go do this, but I don't know if that's really where they're going with it. There is one point where she says Kirk. It seems like she's after Kirk. I think it's possible that the whole attack was designed just to lure the Enterprise there, to lure Kirk there, and now she's going after him.
Yeah.
Which, I imagine they want to eliminate him, so there's no possibility of him becoming the Federation president. But I'm not clear on whether she has some personal vendetta, personal motivation for this, or if she's carrying out some sort of plot being masterminded by Gary Seven. So at least with this one, I don't know where we're going in the next issue, but I'm very curious about it.
Yeah, which is always a good place to be with an ongoing series, that it kind of keeps you interested,
Right.
and wanting to go to that next issue. So good on them. And hopefully both of these, comics will continue their story well, and, we'll get a good wrap up with the Seven comic, and this story will continue to find new and fascinating ways to tell the story as the Enterprise heads home. So, so much fun, of course, getting to talk about the comics. But Chris, I think it's time for us to dive into the interview with James. Well, it's so excited to have James Swallow here to talk about his brand new book, The Dark Veil. It's in the Picard series, but this book actually deals with the Titan and their adventures leading up to what we would see in that series. And so first, James, I got to ask you, because this is such an interesting thing for you. Obviously, you wrote Titan novels before, so you've been an integral part of kind of creating that crew, creating the storylines that move forward for the Titan in the books that we had gotten there. And so I wanted to ask you what it was like to finally write Titan in canon now.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back on the show. It's great to be here again. And as to your question, it was an interesting challenge to kind of thread the needle between what is, as you say, it's a Titan novel, but it's a Picard novel. So is it a Titan novel with a Picard badge on it, or is it a Picard novel with Titan in it? And you can take it either way, I guess. But it was interesting to do that, because we have this new continuity now that has kind of moved on from where the Litverse novels are. So we have a different version of the Titan from the one that you might be familiar with from the novels, but there's also a lot of similarities to it. So what I had to do was kind of chart this course between these two different sort of pole stars. And one of the things that we've been doing with all of the new series of Star Trek books, with the Star Trek Discovery novels and with the Star Trek Picard novels, is we've been working very closely with CBS, primarily with our good friend Kirsten Beyer, who former Star Trek novelist, who's now kind of been upgraded upstairs to being a proper Star Trek writer on the TV show and a producer and everything. She is our kind of point person for that. So we worked very closely together, and when I was given this job to do, I said to her, one of the first things was like, well, how much of the Litverse Titan universe can I bring into this sort of the semi-canonical space that these novels now exist in? And we had a long discussion about, well, maybe this, but not that, bring this character in, but not that character. And, I was just trying to find a kind of good space. So it's interesting to do almost a parallel reality version of these characters, but it's been a really fun challenge. And the core thing about Titan that's always made me enjoy writing stories set on board that ship is the pairing of Riker and Troi is my favorite, two of my favorite Star Trek characters of all time. So the book orbits around their experiences, and I knew that if I continued to follow that path, that would give me a strong basis that the entire novel would kind of orbit around. Did
you sit down with, as we affectionately know her as KMFB, with kind of the timeline of the Titan and where stories that had happened, because you reference the books that came right after Nemesis, where Titan is their mission is kind of preempted of exploring to go to deal with what happened at Romulus. And so was there, like, did you guys sit down with kind of a timeline and be like, okay, this part of the story could fit here and this won't really fit? So because I noticed, obviously, having read all of those, some of the things that, feel very similar to and storylines that feel similar, but then of course there's that divergence that we get. And so was that part of the process, is kind of sitting down with that timeline and seeing like, okay, this fits, this doesn't fit, this doesn't fit, this does fit?
Yeah, a little bit of that. I mean, it's kind of more vague than that, really. A little bit more woolly of it, I think, would to be honest. It's not like I sat there with a checklist going yes, no, kind of crossing out what I can and can't do. This is very much, as I say, it's a different form of a timeline. And there's a couple of times in the book where I kind of deliberately nod towards that, about how things are slightly different with this version of Titan. It's right at the very end of the book. There's a conversation with Picard and Riker, and Picard kind of reflects on the fact that the Titan would have had this mission where it would have gone out and done certain things, and it would have had the very species diverse crew that we saw in the novels, but because of the events with the synth attack on Mars and the Romulan supernova, things had to change. So what I'm directly saying there to readers is, this is kind of where the junction point happened. This is where the Litverse went off in one direction and took one sort of take on this, but these novels are taking a different take, and this is the route that they're going. And these are the kind of the reasons that, things don't kind of marry up 100%.
Yeah. And I think, what I loved about that is that, obviously for somebody who's been so invested in the Litverse side of things, it was so great to see, just those nods there. And so I was kind of wondering, when you talked with Kirsten, were there any kind of, for you in your mind, were there any non-negotiable characters that like you had to have in this novel, that it wouldn't feel like Titan to you without them?
Oh, definitely. And sum that up in 2 words: Christine Vale, right? Because Christine Vale's a character that, that we built from the ground up into the Litverse, and she has a really strong, passionate fan base. And I love writing her as well. I think she's one of my favorite sort of Litverse creations, and it's always fun to kind of revisit her. And I said to Kirsten, I really want to make, can we have Vale in this story? Because I don't want to create a new first officer character from the ground up, because it just won't have the energy and the impact, and it won't have the resonance. And Vale she's such fun to write, and we all loved her, and she absolutely agreed with me on that one. And then we kind of talked around some of the other ideas. She definitely wanted me to make sure that Keru stayed in the story as well.
Yeah, that was great.
Those were the kind of two. From the very beginning, that was kind of, I think from the first conversation, we were like, okay, well, we're going to keep these two. But as for other ones, we weren't sure. We went around and we talked a lot about Tuvok, about whether we wanted Tuvok to be on the story or not. In the end, we made the decision not to put him in that novel, because Tuvok is very much associated with Voyager. And, there was a concern that, like, readerships who maybe aren't as familiar with the Litverse would come to this novel and go, well, why is there a guy from Voyager on this ship? That doesn't make sense. Surely it belongs to this other sort of continuity. So rather than kind of have to go through all the explanation of why he was there and what he was doing, it's like, well, let's just, let's not have Tuvok as a character. So, and the one other character also that I kind of brought over is a supporting character, is Karen McCready, who is one of the engineering officers on the Titan, named after a good friend of mine, a science fiction and fantasy writer. And as I started writing the book, I realized I needed an engineer character, and I just thought, well, I'm just going to drop her in there as well. So those are the 3 sort of key Litverse characters that we brought over. And then thematically, there's a lot of other elements that I added in there, just sort of the sense of it to make it feel like it still feels like a Titan novel, even if, as I say, it's this kind of different version of it.
Well, and I mean, absolutely. I mean, like you said, here with this novel and writing this version, we've got Troi and Riker obviously there, but now they have Thad, which is different. That they have a son so early, so creating that family dynamic between those 3 characters is something that is quite different from what we got in the Titan novels. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated about what you did with the adding Titan into canon now was that relationship, and obviously we didn't get to know Thad at all because of his death. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen Picard series, but and to be able to see those characters interact, and kind of bring Thad to life in a way that you get a picture in some sense of what he is in the show, but here you really get to see that character play out, and that family dynamic again, and one of the big things, which is about where they're going to end up, and planting the seeds about why they're not going to be on the Titan forever.
I mean, again, that's something that there's one of the key directives from the very beginning, again, that Kirsten brought to us was, she said to me, I want this to be a story where Thad is an integral part of the narrative, precisely for all the reasons that you just stated, because we don't know him really in the story. When you see Nepenthe, that episode where we meet Kestra and we go to the Riker-Troi's kind of retirement planet, right? Everything we see about Thad is this kind of like ghost. It's an echo of who that kid was. And so what Kirsten asked me to do is she said, this is the opportunity for us to fill in the backstory of this person that we're never going to know on the TV, but we can put him in a book. And this is one of the great functions of doing science fiction, is it gives you an opportunity to kind of fill in this little lacuna of story. So once I started building that out, I realized that the family is going to be at the heart of this narrative, not just kind of literal blood family, but also found family as well, about talking about family in terms of the crew of the ship. But also when you look at the villainous character we'll have as well, also has a kind of toxic family kind of relationship, which is part of sort of like her baggage. So that was a theme that I wanted to sort of marble throughout the entire story. So once we started building that in, it gave me an opportunity to explain a little bit about who Thad was, and also to cast a different light on the Riker-Troi Starfleet kind of relationship. Because if you look at the way those characters are played out in the Titan novels, in the Liveverse novels, they're on an ongoing mission, and they're heading out into space and they're having these adventures, and there's never really a question in those stories about what's the future going to hold for us. It's about we are on this ongoing narrative and we're going out and having adventures. But of course, with the Picard storyline, we already know where Riker and Troi are going to end up, because we see that they've retired from Starfleet and we know they had this tragedy in their life and it changed the way the direction their life took. So I can kind of show now in this book the beginning of that story, because you know already how it ends. And now I'm saying, well, this is the direction they're taking. And it gave me the opportunity to have Riker and Troi addressing questions that they previously had never considered, which is, are we doing the right thing? Is a future in Starfleet the right thing for us? Maybe are we going to find ourselves in a situation where we have to decide, do we want to continue to be Starfleet officers or do we want to retire and have a family? And of course, we know how that plays out. But this is the first moment where that question really crystallizes for them. And that's not a question I could have asked really in the other books, because it was an ongoing series and it didn't have this kind of predefined endpoint.
Couple things come to mind there. One is, the character of Thad is kind of a wonderkin, with languages, and he's 6 in the book, and so I just wanted to ask you a little bit about writing him, because and we've seen this in Star Trek, with kids that are really, really super smart already at a very young age. Wesley comes to mind, obviously, and so I just wanted to ask you about the process of writing a character like that, and because that's when you're talking about threading a line, that's really difficult to do. To create a character who has this brilliance, and yet at the same time, you don't want to make them like perfect. And what I thought was really interesting is how you thread that line with Thad, where it's like he has this brilliance, and yet he also is 6. And there are lots of things to which he doesn't quite understand the repercussions of his actions yet, because he's 6, he doesn't know everything.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, from a kind of dramatic, mechanical narrative standpoint, the problem with writing kids who are too young is that if you write them 100% true to the way a kid that would be, is they don't have a lot of dramatic agency to them. You can't put them into situations of jeopardy, and you can't have them kind of reasoning things through unless you construct that whole story around them. And so you need to have a kid who is maybe a little smarter than he would be in real life to kind of help propel the story forward. So part of the writing of that kind of lends itself well to creating a character who is a little smarter than maybe his age would normally allow. some of the backstory I love, the initial kind of concept backstory stuff came from Michael Chabon basically handed over this big sheaf of notes, which I think he's just recently put online that I think anybody can read now, about the fictional language and the fictional world of Ardani, which is kind of Thad's legacy, is this idea that he was creating this as a kid. And there was a whole bunch of notes that Michael put together, and I just kind of cherry picked a bunch of stuff from that and drew a lot of my inspiration from there. But I also drew inspiration from some friends of mine who have kids that they homeschool. And their youngest, I mean, he's an adult now, and he's like a computer programmer, and he's a game designer, and he's a sort of super talented, very, very clever young fella. But I remember him when he was very, very young. You know, I've been friends with them for these kids for their entire lives. And I do have a very distinct memory of this young lad, me and him hanging out over the weekend when we were at the family's house. And he was just, you know, he was a little adult. He was really sharp. He was really just clever. And for a while, I forgot I was talking to like a 6-year-old kid. And then he did something wrong, and he stubbed his toe, and he burst out crying. and he suddenly changed back in front of my eyes, changed back into the child that he actually was. And I suddenly thought, oh my God, he's a kid, isn't he? He's just a little kid. And I'd forgotten that he was just a little kid. And that always struck me. And so I touched back on that when I was writing Thad, is the idea of how we as adults can, if you meet a precocious, smart kid, you can kind of be fooled into thinking that they're a little person, a little adult, when in fact that, you know, that's just one facet of who they are. So I tried to draw all of that in and to try and make Thad feel like, you know, I didn't want him to be the kind of the one who solves all the problems, who's the sort of like the super genius kid, but I wanted to make him smart. I wanted to give him this kind of questing nature, which, let's be honest, look at his parents. What kind of person is he going to be? He's going to be that kind of person. So I wanted to try and make him feel as authentic as I possibly could, while still giving him some agency in the story.
Yeah, to me, it was interesting is obviously we knew kind of some of his background, but as you were writing him, I was kind of thinking it almost feels like the personification of Tolkien as a kid, you know, because of his love of languages and creating, you know, imaginary worlds and everything. And Thad very much kind of feels like a happier version of, you know, Tolkien doesn't have a super happy life in his childhood with parents dying and all those kind of things. But, you know, Thad kind of feels like the happier version of that, you know. No, I think what I loved is that, you know, he's a genius in his own right, and yet at the same time, you know, he's very much a child, and to me that really worked. And I was really, you know, thankful for that, because it can. We've all seen the trope. Obviously, we all make fun of Wesley all the time for it, so I thought that it never went that way. So it was perfect, and it just created this nice family dynamic, like you were talking about. And you know, one of the things. I'm pleased to hear
that, because I've always felt. Sorry, I was going to say, I'm really pleased to hear that. I've always felt that Wesley was one of my favorite characters on the show, and I felt that he was never very well served with the writers, who kind of really didn't get a handle on him. So my goal with Thad was to not make that mistake again.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things, you know, I was one of the other things you had mentioned about the, you know, the reason that, you know, Troi and Riker would have these discussions, you know, and I thought was really interesting is, and you were talking about the theme of family, but one of the things I really picked up on is how this book really personifies the idea of fear, and how every single group is feeling that. You know, the Federation and the response to synthetic life, the Romulans with their homeworld on the brink of disaster, and the Jazari who are responding to the change that the Federation's view of a synthetic life has and what it means for them. And, you know, in many ways, fear makes us do really funny things and makes us think very differently. And so many ways, you know, Yoda was really light about what fear makes us do and what it leads to. And seeing how that fear changes the dynamic, you know, like just even thinking about Troi and Riker, you know, there's no fear in Troi and Riker in the original Titan novels, because the Federation is not this Federation that we see in Picard. There isn't that fear for them, and yet we see that introduction of fear and that change. You know, they want to be the Federation that they always knew and loved, but that fear has had an impact on it. It's changed them completely in the sense of how they feel and what they want to do with their lives. And so I just really appreciated that because, as Star Trek does, it is a reflection of our world. And we have so many fears around us these days. And it makes us do funny things.
You're absolutely right. That is Star Trek always is, right? I always say it's the funhouse mirror that you kind of hold up to the real world, where we can tell stories that will maybe, with this sort of candy-colored coating of Star Trek over it, people can look at something that maybe, if it was shown to them directly, might be an issue they might not be able to handle. But if you say, well, let's set it on another planet and people with bumpy foreheads are talking about this issue, suddenly you can kind of look at it from a remove and you can maybe analyze it more, and then that will reflect back into your real-world assumption of things. So, yeah, we are living in a time where there's a lot of stuff to be afraid about, and there are a lot of frightened people, and frightened people make bad choices. And I wanted to put these characters into a situation where they're dealing with the aftermath of choices that they don't agree with, and there's the threat of other choices in the future that they also don't agree with. And it's like, well, how do you, as a good, moral, decent person who wants to do the right thing, how do you chart a course around that kind of stuff? How do you stay true to the sort of better lights of your nature while pressures from the outside are pulling you in different directions? And I think that's something that Star Trek has always sort of concentrated on and showed really well, is that, if we work together, we can be the best possible versions of ourselves. And that's just, for me, touching back on something that is a core tenet of what Star Trek's about.
Well, and it's a difficult thing, too, like you said, when so many different people have made choices around you and trying to decide how then you live in that, and how do you make the right choices regardless of what other people are doing. And that's really what each section, I mean, every group here, whether it's Troi and Riker here representing the Federation, our Romulan commander, and his Tal Shiar, political officer, who's also Vat Vash, and then you've got your Jazari, and everyone is dealing with these different fears, but also the reaction to those fears, and then how they interact or how they perceive what is right and all that. Like it was a really well constructed theme, and I thought you did a great job of just kind of expanding on, one of the things about a series, especially if it's a limited series like Picard was, in the sense that we only had one season, and you can't deal with all the ramifications in that time frame. This really helped, I felt like, expand and allow us to spend more time with especially this theme, which was so important to driving the Picard series. And this is where I think you did a great job of combining, yes, this is a Titan novel, but we're exploring the universe that Picard series gave us in a way that helps us understand that show better, understand the feelings of the people in that show better. And that's, I think, this is where, tie-in fiction, when it's doing its job, is really, it's enhancing then what you'll see later or watch on screen. And I really appreciated how you were able to take that theme and really make it prominent with all of these different groups in a way that brought the show to life in a way that the show just couldn't do in the amount of time it has.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. That's what tie-ins are for. I mean, if you look at what my colleague Una did with Last Best Hope and
yes,
with Mike Johnson on the Star Trek the Picard Countdown series, all of our books have been trying to sort of do what you say, is that you watch Picard and there's a propulsive narrative moving through that story, and that's the narrative that you should be concentrating on. But as you're going through that, you're thinking, that's interesting, that bit there, but that's not the main story. This is the main story over here, and I'm going to follow that. But I wonder what that was all about. And these books allow us to say, well, this was what that was all about. And, for example, Dark Veil is set 1 year after Picard has resigned from Starfleet. So we see that moment in flashback in one of the episodes where he's walked out of the Admiral's office and basically turned in his badge and gun. And this is a year after that. And immediately when I was putting this down as the sort of like the time period this was going to take place, my cogs started turning in my head, and I thought, well, how are other people going to react to this? Because Picard is Picard's story, right? It's his name on the door, right? So it's all about him. But this is an opportunity in a story to tell a little bit about how other people reacted, because my first thought was, if this is a Riker and Troi story, how would they react to the fact that Jean-Luc Picard has resigned from Starfleet? That he goes to Starfleet Command, he gives them that ultimatum, and they say, well, there's the door, and off he goes. What would Riker's reaction be? Well, if you're going to resign, I'm going to resign. Is that what he would do, or would he try and find another path through things? How would the other people who orbit around Jean-Luc Picard as a character react to this? And in this particular situation, how do Riker and Troi react to this? Because this is what that novel's about. And in order to kind of anchor it in that experience, again, to anchor it into Picard's experience as well, there's 2 key chapters in the book where Picard appears and has a sort of contribution to the narrative, where Riker is sort of talking to him about the situation that they're in. Kind of almost like to bookend the novel, really. Because I wanted to make sure that Picard makes an appearance in the novel, not just because his name's on the book, right, but also because I wanted to make it very clear that this is connected to that Picard narrative. So we have a cutaway to seeing Picard a year after he's made that resignation, and it's like, where is his head at in that time, and how has he changed, and what direction, what road is he going down? So to me, that was very important to sort of make sure all those elements mesh together as closely as possible.
Well, and I got to say, I loved the addition of making sure that Picard was a part of the book, and that first chapter that he's a part of, where he's talking to Riker, and one of the opportunities that he has is to possibly go to Baku, and be with an Anej. What an offer! One, because that's going to do wonders for his health, which we will know from the Picard series is not in the best. He's been given a death sentence, basically. There's no cure for what he has. Wow, him saying no to that, really, him not going, he might be kicking himself for not going. So I loved that. But I loved the way in which, like you were talking about, how did his decision reflect on Riker and what he and Troi leave Starfleet. And I loved the fact that, Picard did not feel like he could do any good. And he thought that, his leaving Starfleet would give him the opportunity to make a statement. And yet Riker and Troi have stayed in Starfleet because they still believe there's good that they can do there in that position. And I thought that was so, and you even show that because, you show how, different captains in this area, like from the Lionheart and the Robinson, which are great tie-ins to the Litverse, they have been doing what they can to help the Romulans by, leaving these caches of supplies for them, and I really love that because, it's when we stop trying to do good that things just get worse, and people like Riker and those other captains, Troi, together, they see that we can't stop doing good just because the overall, society is going to stop. We're not going to stop doing what we know is right. And tying that in with, Picard, I thought was just so smart because there's a different reaction between the two characters, and as much as they love each other, Riker is not Picard, he's his own person. And I thought you really did a great job with that differentiation between those characters. And it was then important to show that, yes, the name is Star Trek Picard, but Picard's actions don't make everybody react the same. That was just great, man.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, that was definitely, I wanted to have a moment where I could show that, Riker says, well, we're not going to resign from Starfleet, like you say, because we believe that there's still good that we can do. And it's kind of a lot of it is like, when you're outside the tent, you can't do anything about what's going on inside the tent. So even if Picard's made the decision to leave, Riker's like, if I stay inside, maybe I can still exert an influence. Maybe I can still try and bring things back to true. And that's what he's doing there. But Riker being the kind of guy he is, who's not always, shall we say, constrained 100% by the rules, I can imagine him saying, well, let's just, back channel some stuff here. Yes. Who can I trust? Reach out to, I mean, I know I don't say specifically that Benjamin Sisko is the captain of the Robinson like we did in the Litverse, but that's my inference there. You know, if you're a fan of the Litverse, you go, oh, the Robinson was Sisko's ship. So maybe it's Sisko, maybe it isn't. But what's going on there is definitely Riker and Troi and these other group of captains have kind of had a conversation around 10 forward table and go, you know, could we just do a little bit of help? Just do a little something under the table, off the radar. How could we do that? We could just do a little something, you know, make some sort of effort to do something to help these people, even if we're being told by the powers that be that we can't do anything else. Because Riker's reaction, as you say, because he's William T. Riker, because it's, you know, Deanna Troi, their reactions are completely different from Jean-Luc Picard's. There's a moment in the book where Riker is talking to the Romulan commander, Commander Medaka, and he says, you know, Jean-Luc Picard resigned over this. And the commander says, yeah, and he went back to his farm. You know, not all of us are privileged enough to be able to just walk away from this. You know, he went back to his farm and just kind of sat there and sulked. And this is kind of what he's inferring, right? And Riker's a bit insulted about that. He's like, you know, he wants to sort of jump to his friend's defense. But there's actually an element of truth to that, is that Picard is in a privileged position where he can make this grand statement and then step away from things, even if, you know, of course he's troubled by it. And of course he wants to do something more to help. But he makes this grand statement, he goes off to his farm. And meanwhile, everybody else is still dealing with the fallout. And Riker is in a position where he's still in Starfleet, so at least he can do something in a small way, hopefully, to kind of practically assist with the problem. But at the end, they're all kind of chipping away at this colossal, great big imminent problem, which is the supernova. And all they're doing is just slowing it down. It's still going to come. It's still this massive threat that everybody's going to have to deal with.
Well, and there was such a beauty to that because, you know, our greatest captains in Star Trek are the ones who've always been willing to bend the rules when they didn't fit with what was right. You know, that's, you know, our greatest captains in Star Trek, you know, have always been the ones who knew what was right, they knew what was wrong, and they stuck to that regardless of what the quote-unquote rules said. And, you know, and implying that, you know, you've got possibly, you know, the Sisko here helping out maybe, or you know, I guess Lionheart, wasn't that Vaughn's ship, if I remember correctly, in the Litverse?
That was a ship that I created for the Poison Chalice.
Oh, that's right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
So I just put that. That's me being a bit self-indulgent there. Just putting in a starship that I created that I liked.
But I mean, but that's the thing is, like, again, we're seeing these characters. You know, they're standing up for what's right, regardless of what the, you know, those on high say. You know, we're not going to negate our principles, and part of that, you know, really led to this. There was a really interesting theme for me throughout the book. Is there's kind of this I like to call it twisted truth. You know, especially with dealing with Romulans. The Romulan way of life is one of conspiracy, half-truths, and, you know, just being confounded in all ways, shapes, and forms, you know. And their life, now, when you add the fear, has created a paranoia, which makes it really hard to know who to trust, you know. It's hard to know who to believe when fear makes us, you know, treat so much of untruth as the gospel. And I mean, wrapping that into the Vought Vash storyline and their complete misunderstanding of what they have seen, they have a bit of this quote unquote truth, but it's completely twisted. And it's made it very difficult to know who to look to, and I really appreciate that because, you know, it was a great mirror for, you know, not only ourselves, but, you know, the Federation's going through that too. They have a twisted truth on what happened with synthetic life there on Mars. And that truth has completely twisted everything about the Federation. So you have these two great superpowers who are completely driven by things that are only really half true. And it's really only the truth that could set them free, which will be, you know, what we'll see in the Picard series. And I really appreciated that because it's a very poignant theme for where we're living today.
And I wanted to kind of explain that, you know, that idea articulates itself in the conversations between Riker and Medaka, is where we have these two guys who are I wanted them to be, mirror images of each other. We've always seen Romulans as a particular kind of person, so I very much wanted to write a Romulan captain in this story with a ship that feels like it's the Romulan equivalent of the Titan, where it has, a captain with a similar kind of character to them. It's not a ship that's going out there doing evil things and subterfuge. It's just a regular ship of the line doing regular ship of the line kind of stuff, but getting pushed into situations where bad stuff is happening, and you have to kind of, the captain has to step up and go, okay, what's the best way to guide a course through this? I wanted to have a captain who has a moral core, who's a strong person, who, as a father as well as a leader, to reflect the man that Riker is, and then put these two guys in a situation where they're on opposite sides of the fence, and there's this yawning chasm of distrust between the two of them, but they're both good men in bad situations. And what they probably both want more than anything is to be able to kind of shake hands and say, let's work together and make things better. But events around them are pulling them apart, pulling them away from that realization, but they're still struggling to try and pull back the other way. So that tension, I really wanted to make sure that that was a core part of the storyline, to show that not all Romulans are, conspiratorial backstabbers, right? There are good people there who are trying to do the right thing, just as there are on the side of our heroes.
And it was fascinating to me because, this storyline with this twisted truth, it really kind of, there's a theme in the new Wonder Woman 84 of, nothing good is born from lies. And that's kind of what we see in this book. Even the Jazari, it's not until the truth about them is revealed that it allows them, the truth sets them free. And it allows them, as well as Riker and Troi, to be able to come up with a plan that's going to save their civilization. Because all the lies are gone, and now we can have a firm foundation to work from. And very much the kind of the metaphorical dark veil of the story is yes,
lies and untruth. That is what we're talking about. That is the dark veil over this story is lies, and if you have that, it masks absolutely everything. I mean, it comes. I don't know if you know it comes from a quote by Benjamin Disraeli, which is, if I get it correct, it's all is mystery, but he is a slave who will not struggle to penetrate the dark veil. Mm. So the suggestion there that, that we all struggle to kind of see truth. And that is what's going on that's the background radiation of this story, is about seeing truth and seeing through lies. And like you say, your idea there, the way you conjured it, I think, is you hit the nail on the head, the twisted truth, where it's been refracted through a prism, and so you think, well, this is the truth. And it's not. Now you're only seeing part of it, and because you aren't seeing the whole truth, you're being led down a dark path. Well,
and it comes from that idea is when we do think that we completely know everything, and we stop asking any questions, and there stops being communication and openness, not only between ourselves, and quote unquote our group, but the other groups, and we just begin to shut ourselves off, as the Federation has done to the Romulans, as the Romulans basically have done to the Federation at this point, and then as the Jazari have done to everyone in the first place, because of their fear, from where they come from. And I wanted to dive into them as a race because I really thought that they were fascinating for this book, and a great... obviously, they're in a kind of the overall mirror for a lot of the things that have happened with the Federation and with the Romulans. And so I just kind of wondered for you where the inspiration came in creating them as this gigantic mirror for the situation that's been going on in the Picard series.
Well, the kind of the core elements of this story were originally kind of an idea I was kicking around to do as a kind of lit verse Titan novel. And I wanted to do a story about a generation ship, a group of people who were leaving the Federation to go off and strike off on their own. And the idea was going to be that there would be, the Titan and a Romulan ship escorting this vessel to the edge of the Federation border where they could wave them off. And then there would be this situation would develop. But as I started kind of building the narrative to fit into the Picard timeline, I realized that I needed much more than that to make these characters and their motivation feel true and authentic. And that was when I hit on the idea that their true nature. I mean, spoiler alert, we're going into big spoiler territory now. Is their idea of their true nature of being an android species that's kind of been hiding in plain sight for all of this time, and how the Zat Vash would react to the idea of discovering that, because to them, that's absolutely terrifying, because they're so, convinced that anything that is any sort of form of android synthetic life is totally terrifying and is going to destroy them. To discover something like that, how that would feed into the paranoia of somebody who was part of that, and the reactions they would have. Once I kind of got those connections, I realized the story just started to build out and build out. I don't know if you've picked up on the hints I've dropped in there about the origin of the Jazari.
Yeah, and that's something that was just really... I was getting some of it, I think, but I wanted to ask you about that because it felt really familiar, and it's my fault for not completely getting exactly what you were going for. And so please tell me, because I was racking my brain, and it's just... I'm getting old, I think.
So I'm being pretty subtle about it, but the big spoiler is that they are the androids from I, Mud. So if you remember that episode?
Yes, because I was like, this feels so familiar, and it's been a while since I have gone through and watched TOS, and so I was like, this feels so familiar. It's like on the tip of my tongue, but I can't get it. Oh, okay, yep, that makes complete sense.
I mean, it's. I wanted to put that in there. It's one of those kind of things where I thought, if you don't miss it, if you don't know that episode, it's not going to be important to you. But if you are kind of looking for it, I wanted to build a connection in it that kind of goes right back to the original series. Because when we saw those androids, we learned a little bit about them, that they were sent to our galaxy to sort of explore, and they run afoul of Harry Mudd, and the episode's all kind of like jolly and it's very funny. And it ends up with them sort of being overpowered by the ability for humans to be emotional and logical. And I always liked that idea, but again, like so many cool things in Star Trek, we never went back and kind of revisited them. And I just thought to myself, well, what would, originally I was building the idea of these guys being an android race. And then I thought, well, I've got this really interesting thing here from TOS that was never really explained away. Because what happened to them after that story? What happened to that planet full of androids? What choices did they make? And I realized I had this need in my story for an android species. And I just thought it just makes perfect sense to me that they would go through this evolutionary change after meeting Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Harry Mudd, and realize that, they were, how did these humans defeat us? Well, because we allowed ourselves to be sort of overruled by them. So we have to figure out how to improve ourselves and how to better perform our function, which is to kind of observe and record and everything. And that's how the Jazari grew out of that into being this species that, they basically invent a species that will allow them to kind of go out into the universe and meet people and talk to people and have nobody know that they're actually androids observing them, which is something very much that, we've seen the Federation do the same thing with their duck lines and their, people getting disguised as aliens and going onto, different planets and mingling with their species. And I thought, well, what if there was another species doing that to the Federation? And, there's even a line where Riker and Troi are talking to them, and Riker's kind of like, I'm kind of a little bit embarrassed that this has been happening to us. And then Deanna says, well, you did that yourself, in that episode First Contact where he goes to Malcor 3, right? Yep. And then they both did it when they disguised themselves as Proto-Vulcans in Who Watches the Watchers, that episode.
Yep.
The title of that one.
And don't you remember Star Trek Insurrection?
And of course, right? So it's kind of like, sauce for the goose, right? It's like, you did it to other aliens. You shouldn't really be surprised when another species does it to you. So that was just like a little kind of fun thing to explore. And once I had that idea, I just folded it into the greater narrative.
I love that because I like not retconning myself, but there was a hint in my brain. I was like, is this like the I, Mud character? Like, because the way you described them being created and everything felt so familiar, like obviously, and you had just dove right in there and just plucked that out, from the Star Trek ether because it's already there. And I think that's brilliant. And, what I thought, where this really connected to me with the idea of truth is that if they had been honest with the Federation, how different would the Federation look at synthetic life, possibly, because they had been truthful? because they had been a race to which had not gone insane, and not killed everybody on Mars. And you would have had a juxtaposition of what, AI can be, and I really appreciated that, because their lack of honesty with the Federation actually hurt the Federation from having a different perspective, from being able to see something from a different point of view, as Star Wars would say. And I really appreciate that. And it, again, all these themes interweave because it's the Jazari's fear that leave them to do that. And yet it shows just how important, openness and communication and truth really is. Because, again, nothing good is born from lies. And, in some ways, the Jazari's reticence of sharing themselves fully with the Federation actually hurts the Federation. And isn't that what the Federation is all about? Is that our openness and honesty and our sharing together makes us better than if we didn't have each other.
I mean, consider for a second the kind of the fallout from that episode of Star Trek, the episode of from My Mud, right? If the mud androids there had said, well, you know what, we're going to reveal ourselves fully, maybe even like join the Federation, and we would have had android crew members serving on Starfleet ships way before Data was even built.
Yes. How
would culture have been different, right? Because let's face it, and again, this is something that I've banged on before with my Titan novels. I'm always fascinated by the idea of AI, of synthetic intelligence. And Star Trek's never really given AI a very good shake. Let's be honest. I mean, it's, when you look in the plus and minuses column for, computers, synthetic intelligences, and androids, they're mostly on the bad side. I mean, Data's done a lot of work, but he's like just one guy, right? There's
he's like the token AI.
The present day, it's true. I mean, even coming up to like the present day, when I was watching Lower Decks and Peanut Hamper turns up, right? The exocomp. And I was like, oh, wow, the exocomp. And then she turns out to be a bit of a dick, right? At the end of the story. I mean, not quite flying up the ship, right? But even then I was like, oh, can we not have an AI character who's just like a good person for a change, apart from Data, I mean, we've got Data and Lal, right? And that's about it. Every time we talk about computers, synthetic computers, everybody's thinking of like the M5 and Ultimate Computer blowing up starships full of people, or it's Law being super evil. We've always got this negative connotation. So I wanted to say, well, not all androids are bad people, not all synthetic intelligences are bad, but they can also be subject to the same kind of fears and make the same kind of mistakes that organic life forms can make it too. And that is exactly what the Jazari do here. Is like you say, they're so afraid of their first encounter with the Federation, of the way it kind of like disarms their entire civilization, that they end up spinning this elaborate lie that lasts for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then eventually leads to them just kind of running away.
It's so funny you talk about this whole idea of AI, because we're hoping to, in a couple of months here, as we kind of have a break from new books coming out, one of the things we wanted to continue was what Bruce and Dan had been doing, which is walking through all the 24th century novels. And the next one on the list is Synthesis, the Titan novel. And so we're hoping to cover that, which is all about this idea that you were talking about of AI. And I think that, it's really interesting. And something Chris, because of our time zones, couldn't be here. But one of the things he mentioned was this, idea of the AI ban, and how this kind of reflects even our own world's ideas of AI. And I think you just really nailed that on the head of just like even Star Trek, we have this fear of AI, and I think there is a portion of that comes down to so much of our science fiction has been about AI taking over, obviously we're all we're as human beings afraid of Skynet, like I think that is so ingrained in our psyche, is that is what we are fearful of something that we can't control and that has no emotional attachment to anything, just as pure logic is going to dominate us. And that's something that, when we think about Star Trek, like all the way back to the motion picture, with V'ger, having no emotional attachment to anything, just pure logic, just pure knowledge, just accumulating knowledge. That's what we're fearful of. We basically want there to be a personal, omnipotent being, basically, one who longs to know us and have a relationship with us, not something that's just this pure logical thing that we would see as, being tyrannical. So that's a really big subject, James, and I love that this book is really digging into those type of fears that we have, as people, as we're reading the book. Those come from us too.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's right there in science fiction. It's like it's one of the myths of sci-fi, going all the way back to arguably one of the first science fiction stories ever, which is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is that is a story about someone creating artificial life, which then kind of goes rogue and tries to know itself, and everything becomes self-destructive. That is one of the core tenets, one of the very beginning pieces of science fiction that ever existed. And we've just constantly, years and years, we've gone back to the well with that and asked that question, what does it mean to create artificial life, artificial intelligence? And it seems like we always kind of fall on the idea of like, it's going to be terrible and it will destroy us. And it's like, well, maybe that's a possibility that's on the table, right? Maybe that's the Skynet Terminator possibility, right? But what if it isn't? What if we are destined to create artificial life, and we'll create something that will exceed us, that will make our own experience and our own existence greater by the fact that it exists? That is an equally interesting idea. It will help, Data's mythology in the Star Trek series is of a life form struggling to know itself. And I think that was at the core of who he was as a character. And that was a fascinating journey to watch him as he went through the show, learning about who he was, learning about humanity, and reflecting back at us as he's learning about who he is and struggling to know himself. And that journey is fantastic. And that's one of the greatest things that Star Trek has done is taking that idea and just spinning it on its head and say, let's not have a story about a machine that will destroy everybody. Let's have a story about a machine that will teach us more about being human.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things about AI stories that can do, because again, it's coming back to what I said before about the funhouse mirror, right? It's the reflection. If we tell a story about AI, we're really telling a story about ourselves.
Yeah. No, I heartily agree. And one of the things that this all kind of connected to me again, and one of the major themes that I really saw here is learning from the past. And I love the speech that Troi and Will give to the Jazari about the Federation, and how they don't negate the sins of the Federation's past, and especially their recent past with AI, but they talk about this idea of moving forward with the wisdom you learn from your mistakes and for a better future. And in many ways, for that to happen, it takes us not being driven by fear, but that we're actually, better together. That we would see the errors of our ways, and that we would be able to move past them. In some ways, it takes self-forgiveness, right? As a society, we've got to forgive ourselves so that we can move forward. And I really appreciated that because, the Federation has made a mistake here. They've made a huge mistake. As Michael what's his face? Joe Bluth would say, "I've made a huge mistake, Michael." And there's this thing that the Federation needs to overcome, and I really appreciated that because I see this in our own society where we continue to relitigate the past in a way that's not helpful. It's harmful, and we're not helping ourselves because it just kind of creates this fear in us instead of saying, okay, what's the lesson that we should be learning here, and how do we then apply that and move forward? And that's always what Star Trek has been about, in our greatest stories. And so I love that Troi and Will point that out to them. We've made the mistake here. We know we need to learn from it. And really the only way to move forward in that is that you have to be, as Will says, you have to be the light in the darkness. You can only do what you can, where you can, when you can, and this is the best way to make a difference. And you know, that tied into the, you know, the Starfleet ships that are leaving these gifts for the Romulans where they can, you know, because they know what's right. And it really hit me hard, that lesson. And I thought it was really beautiful because I think it's one that our entire world just needs to learn.
Riker's saying a lot there. He's echoing kind of my personal thoughts about the circumstances that I personally have been going through over the last few years, about the circumstances I find myself and my family and my friends, my culture, my country, all of the choices that are being made around me, things that have happened that I don't agree with, decisions that are going in directions I'm not happy with. And then as an adult, I have to look at that and go, well, how do I change that? How do I affect change as a person who wants to try and move towards what I think is the better choice? And if I'm not a person who's in charge of like governments and nation states, how do I, as just an ordinary man, how do I put a little bit more light back in the world? And the way you do that is you try and make good choices. You try and be the best person you can. You try and do the best you can in everyday situations, you know, from the smallest sort of working upwards, because that's all we can do, right? As just regular, ordinary people. We can try and affect change where we can. And so Riker is definitely echoing my thought process there, is that, you know, if you make a mistake, you have to own it and you have to move on and do the best you can to kind of row your way back from it.
Well, and what it also showed too is that, you know, and this has been, I think, a real sin for me in Star Trek, is that for most of the time we've seen many of the civilizations and societies as monoliths. And, you know, you break down those barriers, especially with your Romulan characters you have here in the book specifically. But we have to remember that the actions of some don't reflect the whole. You know, in our societies, even in groups in our societies, like we can't just continue to paint with broad brushes and expect that to turn out well. You know, and so I really appreciated that, because, you know, Troi and Will are a part of the Federation, but that doesn't mean that they're in lockstep with everything that the Federation has done. You know, there are different Jazari characters who are not lockstep with everything that the Jazari have done. There are Romulans who aren't lockstep with everything the Romulan Empire has done. And if we treat everybody as that, if that's the case, and instead of like individuals who we need to actually have a conversation with and get to know before we make a judgment on them, we're either going to be stuck where we always are, or we're going to forge a better future. And that's one of the things that we can do is actually treat everybody as if they're an individual who is worth getting to know, and make a judgment based off our actual knowledge and not just some half-truth that gets portrayed in the media.
Because, I mean, fiction often will kind of go down that route of the idea of the sort of, as you say, the kind of monocultural ideal. And the reason that's done in fiction is because it's an easy way to help tell stories, you know. So
yes,
every Klingon is an honorable warrior type, right? And so, well, that can't be true. There have to be Klingon accountants, and there have to be Klingon farmers, and there have to be Klingon yogurt extractors, right? There have to be Klingons who aren't all warriors, right? They might have that sort of warrior culture and that warrior ethic, but not everyone is a soldier in the Klingon Empire, because it just wouldn't work. In just the same way that, you know, Romulans are kind of characterized as being this sort of backhanded, sneaky troublemaker species, and they can't all be like that. I mean, maybe there's something in their culture that kind of gives them a leaning towards appearing in that fashion, but not every single one of them would have exactly that type of cultural makeup. So, you know, in the story, what I'm trying to do is show that's the truth of these people. Is there's a line that Madaka says to Riker. She says, "The mask you show us is not who you are, just as the mask we show you is not really who we are. But it's important for us to make you think one thing because it benefits us. But that's not really the absolute truth of who we really are."
Yeah, and I think, you know, as we talked about with the Jazari and the idea of these twisted truths, like it requires us to have the courage to drop our masks and show each other the truth of who we really are, so that we can move forward together. That's the only way that that's ever going to happen. And, you know, it doesn't mean that we're always going to agree with one another, or we're going to either like each other, but, you know, it does help break down barriers that we just naturally put up. And it's just really moving. I think, again, one of the things that this book does is it weaves every single one of the themes together into a tapestry that really fits the story of what we saw in Picard. But I think it really deepens what we saw in Picard in a way that the show just wasn't able to do, because it has its own focus. And I really appreciated that. So one thing, and this is a spoiler, we've already been into spoiler territory, but there is a cameo at the end of the book with a character that we all know and love. And I just wanted you to talk about, you know, adding him in here and you know, obviously his connection with kind of tying all this together with what Picard shows us and what, you know, Star Trek 09 showed us, and kind of bringing that part of the story together.
Well, the character is none other than Spock. And his appearance in the story, once I kind of hit on the idea of it, I thought this will be a lot of fun, because it goes very much right at the end of the book. And I wanted to just kind of let's put a fun rug pull in there that would completely wrong foot the audience. And what's great about it is when he meets Riker on board this Romulan ship, Riker is completely wrong-footed as well. So Riker has exactly the same experience that I hope the readers are having at that moment, which is like, oh my God, Spock's here. How did that happen? And part of that came out, again, out of the conversation that I was having with Kirsten, is we were talking about the nature of the Romulans and what was going on in Romulan culture at this point. And we were talking about Spock's attempt to kind of continue the unification movement forward. And of course, if you've been watching Discovery, you know that ultimately that unification movement becomes a complete and full reality as the Vulcans and the Romulans finally reunite as Navarre. And they go back to being the unified species that they were right back at the beginning of their history. So we wanted to just remind people in this story that was still going on, that the unification, the reunification, I should say, movement had not kind of gone away. And of course, with the issue with the supernova, it's like, what happened to all these people? We know what Spock's fate is because of the 2009 movies. You know, we know he travels back in time, and that's the end of him. But is that the end of the movement that he started moving? The stuff that he was pushing forward? Obviously, it wasn't, because it plays out later on, hundreds of years into the future in Discovery. But we wanted to just put a little nod to that, to say this is what Spock was doing at this point in history. You know, he intervenes in this story because you know, he hears about Riker in a situation and he basically comes to help out. But part of what he's doing is tying up a few little threads here and there with some of the stuff. I pulled some stuff out of the Star Trek Countdown comics, because there's discussion in that says that it was Geordi LaForge who built the jellyfish ship.
Yes. That
Spock uses to travel back. So I wanted to just kind of say, you know, here's Spock saying, you know, I want to talk to Geordi LaForge about this starship design idea I've got. And it's like, that's a little nod to that. But the main part of it was to show that the unification movement does not get destroyed by the Romulan supernova, and that those people don't get kind of left behind on Romulus to die. Is that those people are still out there in the Romulan diaspora, still trying to make that happen, so that when you see it happens hundreds of years into the future, it feels like that's a complete contiguous line from that two-part episode of TNG right the way up to what happens in Discovery.
Yeah, it just worked really well, and you know, obviously, the connection between 09 and Picard and all that, it's slightly messy, as it is when you're trying to combine all of these things written by different writers and different ideas. But I love the way that you kind of threaded that needle in there and help connect all of these things, like you said, with even the Countdown comics, using where you could there and all of that, and it's fun, you know. I think that's the thing, you know, we got to remember with all this. It is also meant to be fun, and I thought that was just a great connection. And it made sense that you would use him to be an influence to help with Riker in this situation. You know, I loved that, and I loved getting them to see that interaction there, you know, because, you know, Spock is such a long-lived character and has had so many different influences. You know, he's already there, and so you putting him into the story makes complete sense, and it was just so much fun. And it was a great way to kind of, I felt like, wrap up the book. And again, we've got, 5 years, I think, by this point from where we're going to be in the Picard series, I think. So there's other stories that we can tell here as well to kind of continue to fill in the gaps if they want. And I hope they will, because, to me, this book really helped with fleshing out a lot of the details and the thematic elements of the Picard series in a way that makes those sit better with me personally as a reader.
I mean, that's kind of what we've been doing with the Discovery novels. We followed the same model with Picard. With the Discovery books, most of the Discovery novels are either kind of side stories or they're prequel stories about characters in the main narrative, showing you aspects of them that maybe, had been glossed over or just not really very well explored in the series, because the narrative of Discovery is very tightly packed. There's not a lot of place where you could, let's just drop a story in between these two episodes. And that's even worse for Picard, because the Picard story, there's no gaps in there at all. There's absolutely no fat in it. There's no way you could slot a story in like, the crew of La Sirena go stop off on a planet on the way somewhere and have an adventure. That's just not going to happen. So the stories we're writing about Picard are these stories that build out, like you say, open out these different narrative elements. I mean, when we first had the discussion about doing a Picard novel, this wasn't even the book I was going to write. We were actually discussing doing a book about Seven of Nine's storyline.
Oh wow! Okay.
Saying, there's this big gap in the when Seven turns up and she's this really cool kick-ass Fenris Ranger, and it's like, well, how did she get to there from where we last saw her on screen in Voyager in Endgame when Voyager comes home, and that's the end of the stories. How did she get from there to here? And we talked a lot about that, about how that narrative could work. And I had what I thought was a really cool idea. I wanted to do it like a kind of Western. If you're familiar with the movie The Searchers,
oh yes,
I wanted to do kind of like a kind of riff on that. But as we talked more and more about it, the decision kind of came down from the show is like, this is a really cool idea, and we want to keep our powder dry on that and maybe do something in the show about it. So rather than exploring it in a novel, and I said, okay, that's fine. As a tie-in writer, you have to follow the show always leads, right? So they decided that, that might be something that they would pick up themselves at some future point. So we started looking at other avenues that we could explore. And the two other themes that we were talking about was, one was saying, well, what about doing a story about Riker and Troi and building out this narrative about their son Thad that we never really saw. The other option is we talked about doing a story about Riker about Worf becoming captain of the Enterprise.
Which you mentioned in the book, which was so great.
So in the wake of Picard's resignation, and I think Una talks about this a bit in Last Best Hope as well, Worf becomes captain of the Enterprise. And if you look at his kind of like, he's got a kind of like slightly ill-starred kind of like rise up the command track. And he's had to work really, really hard for it. And then he gets put in command of the Enterprise, not because, I wouldn't say it's not because he deserves it, but because of what happens with Picard. It's like suddenly he's pushed into the position. And maybe he might not have felt like he was ready for it. And I'm like, that's a really interesting story to tell as well. But ultimately, I chose to tell the Riker and Troi story because they're the two characters that I really love them a lot. And I thought that's the story I want to tell. And I hope, I don't have any kind of inside poop to give you on this, but I hope somebody will do the Worf story as well, because that I think would be really, really cool.
I'd love it. I'd love it again, too. That's, that I think it's a great storyline, and he's a character to which I would love to see follow it, and his command of the Enterprise I think would be really, really interesting. So all of those ideas honestly sound great, and I hope they all get followed up with in some way, shape, or form. It obviously, from being a person who has really loved most of the Litverse, especially this 24th century era, any time I can see these different characters and where they go, it's exciting to me. And so, James, with you've just had the Dark Veil come out, and so what else do you have coming up that people need to know about that they can be looking forward to from you, so they can continue to support your writing?
Well, I am working on a new Star Trek project right now. I have to be careful what I say because this hasn't been officially announced. But I'm working on something, and it's going to be, you'll probably find out a little bit more about that probably towards maybe summertime, towards later in the year. But we're keeping that undercover right now. But beyond that, I'm still working pretty hard on my my original thriller series. I do a series of my Mark Dane action thrillers. Those are kind of contemporary, modern day, fast-paced, high-tech techno thrillers. And just recently, the US edition of Ghost, which is the third book in the series, just came out in hardcover, and the fifth novel, Rogue, that's going to be coming out in paperback here in the UK in April. But beyond that, nothing else I can really speak about. It's all kind of like I've signed up to a whole lot of NDAs, and you know how these things go. Is you have the ninjas from the company you're working for, like, don't say too much because that's it. We'll chloroform you and stick you in a bin somewhere, and that's as much as you can say. So I've got some cool stuff I'm working on. I always say to people, if you want to keep an eye on what's up with me, just follow me on Twitter at JMSwallow, or come along to jswallow.com, which is my official website. And I always kind of try and keep that as up to date as possible about my work and what cool stuff I've got coming.
That's great. Yeah. And definitely we'll keep up, with that, just to make sure we have all that information coming out with what you're going to be doing with Star Trek and elsewhere. So, James, as always, though, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to you for joining us on the show. It makes such a difference to be able to dive in deep with the authors. And, the Dark Veil, added a ton of depth, I think, to the Picard series, and just so many wonderful themes to be able to talk through, which is the power of great Star Trek. And so I really appreciate you spending this time with us, and can't wait to see what you have coming up next.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. It's always fun to talk, like you say, in depth about these sort of things. I always feel very privileged to be kind of part of the Star Trek universe. I mean, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Trek nerd from back in the 80s, and I've been watching all of the Star Trek shows. Just finished, Discovery only yesterday, seeing the season finale for that, and being kind of a bit of a Star Trek high, having sort of had so much cool stuff to look forward to. And of course, here we are. We're possibly the best year ever to be a Star Trek fan, right? With so much new stuff, so much new content coming out right now. It's fun to be just have my hands in this universe and be able to add to it creatively, and also be part of the readership and viewership of these great ongoing stories.
Yeah, this is great, James. We'll look forward to talking to you soon. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, Chris, it's always so much fun to be able to talk to the authors, and I'm so sorry that you were not able to be there. This is one of those where both Una and James are in the UK, and that makes it difficult with the time zone. So I was able to get this interview where you got the interview with Una, and I guess maybe we should start flipping coins at this point when we have that. But I
guess so. I mean. The time that you and James recorded this interview, I think you started at 2 a.m. my time. So that was one that was not in the cards for me.
Well, it was great. I hope everybody enjoyed the novel and the interview. I personally have to say, and I told this to James, after we stopped recording, but I really liked this book. I thought it was phenomenal. And what this book did for me in helping ameliorate some of the issues that I have with Picard, not all of them, but some of them, in the sense that him and Una, their books together had did such a good job of helping explain the galaxy of the Picard universe, and why it is the way it is. And James did a fantastic job with this, and it was so good to be back with him, of course, with his work on Titan beforehand, and the other books, and now to bring it into canon was just phenomenal. So hopefully everybody had a great time with it.
Yeah, I'm sad I missed it, but I've been enjoying the book and look forward to the next interviews that we have coming up. So, Matthew, when you are not trying to get yourself a posting there aboard the Titan, where can people find you?
Well, you can find me. I just remembered this, Chris. James is the one who put me into a Star Trek book as a Star Trek ship.
Yeah, well, and me too. Yeah,
with a Titan book. Well. So, from the Poison Chalice. Yep. Anyway, That just came to mind. But anyway, so you could find me all over social media under the name Matt Rushing02. If I'm on that social media platform, you'll find me under that moniker. Here on the network, you can find me doing the 602 Club, which you can follow on Twitter as well at the 602 Club, where we're talking about all things geeky that we love that aren't Star Trek. And of course, you'll have coming soon for you a new podcast from John Mills and I, as we're talking about all of the directorial works of Zack Snyder on Snyder Cuts. So I look for that. Of course, Chris, when we get a chance, we're also doing the Orb, and we promise, folks, we were even talking about tonight, we're working on getting you some more orbs. We want to be back just as much as you guys want us back, so make sure you check that out. And then, of course, you can find me over on the Nerd Party Network doing Owlpost with Dre Kaufman as we're finishing out the Harry Potter series one chapter at a time. And then Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills. Every week, a Star Wars topic from us. It's a Star Wars podcast, so hopefully you'll check that out. Now, Chris, if people are just wanting to catch up with you and see what's going on and what you've got planned these days, where can people find you?
Well, at the moment, that would be on Twitter, because that's where I'm most active right now. I do have some podcasting on the horizon. I just made the transition, the long-awaited transition with my job. Still doing the same magazine, but the behind-the-scenes logistics of that have changed a bit and should put me in a better position to be able to do other stuff. So on the horizon, I'll have some more podcasts coming up. But for now, I'm doing a DS9 rewatch. Just started. Of course, I've been watching Discovery as it played out its third season and such, and I talk about that stuff on Twitter. So C. Bryan Jones, letter C, and Bryan with a Y is the place to find me there. And otherwise, in terms of podcasts, there's The Ready Room. Larry and I have been talking about recording a new episode soon where we'll do our recap of Season 3 of Discovery. I have been working on some episodes of The Edge to fill out this season of Discovery with my usual format. And also, we have, as you mentioned, the Orb going on there, and Interface I plan to get going again soon as well. And Matthew, it's funny, you mentioned James put you in the Poison Chalice as the Matt Russ, which was the Andorian ship, and that was a Titan novel, and the one that James put me in was also a Titan novel.
That's right.
Sight Unseen.
That's right. I totally forgot.
He made me the captain of the USS Tokyo.
A classic.
And I was on a 4-year mission to the Gom Nebula. So that's the book. So he's put both of us in Titan novels, which was fun.
Good times. Well, Chris, we do want to also say a quick thank you to our associate producers through Patreon, Greg Rosier and Casey Petit. We really want to thank them for the support of Literary Tracks, of course, the network. As we head into 2021 now, we can absolutely use your support because there is no way that we can bring this network to each and every week without your support. And we definitely and would love to see those levels of support rise. It's been very difficult for us to make sure that this is all keep coming to you each and every week, Chris, as you know. And so absolutely, where could they go if they wanted to be a part of the network and support the network?
Yeah, well, that is very important, especially right now because we're having a little bit of difficulty that we're working through due to the pandemic and various factors, which have created some issues supporting the network. If you'd like to help out, just go to patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to find out how. I am going to be updating that page soon. I've actually gone in and tried to update it and ran into some problems there on the back end of how to do it. But anyway, we are going to be adjusting some of the perks and the levels. I have some ideas. Of course, we'll have the roundtables going again. I've got some ideas for other ways for us to all get together and have fun talking about Star Trek online here during the pandemic beyond the usual roundtable format. And also some ideas for some patron-only content that I'm planning to produce, some shorter content that should be fun and interesting and you'll only be able to get through Patreon. So please check it out, patreon.com/TrekFM. And we could definitely use your support and really, really thank you very much to everyone who is supporting the network now. Well, Matthew, I'm going to run and make sure Bones is okay because they took him back up to the ship, and I hope he's mixing up one of his own little green elixirs to make himself better, because those people in Proxima Centauri really need his help.
That really does sound like a good idea, Chris, because you know how I love Bones. But we do want to say thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.